Hi everyone, it's Megan
and Brittany,
and we are
Teach Me ABA,
powered by Piles and Associates. Thanks for tuning in today. We are going to discuss teaching Mands and also how to generalize Mands, because you need to focus on some things that are a little different than generalizing other types of skills.
The good thing is we'll also have examples for you on how to teach every single one of these Mands.
As you probably know, children with developmental disabilities often have delays in the development of language. This can often lead to problem behaviors because problem behaviors usually serve a communicative function. So somebody's trying to ask for something when they're engaging in these difficult behaviors. In 1985, Carr and Duran did a study on functional communication training in which they taught Mands to replace problem behaviors that serve the same function. Mands are often the first verbal operand that's learned because they directly benefit the speaker. Because of this can condition the speaker's own voice as a reinforcer. When you start by teaching Mands, this increases the likelihood that the individual will engage in more complex communication skills later on in their life.
B.S. Skinner says that a man is reinforced by a characteristic consequence. It is controlled by deprivation and satiation.
This means that when you're teaching a Mand, the consequence that you should provide is what was requested. That's how you teach the Mand operand. So the way that we control and contrive Mands is we can either withhold something or we can give somebody too much of something that they don't want. Jack Michael further clarified the definition of a Mand by saying that the Mand is a verbal operand in which the response is under control of a relevant MO to that consequence. This means that the antecedent needs to be a motivating operation, and motivating operations can go beyond satiation and deprivation. If you think about when you eat a bag of salty chips, it makes you thirsty. It's not that you're deprived from water, maybe you just drank water, but the saltiness makes you want water more. So he has a little more holistic view of what can motivate a Mand.
Now let's talk about the ABCs of Mands. Antecedent, that would be your motivating operation. Behavior, which is when a person makes the request, or this is also called the speaker behavior. Lastly is a consequence, and that's when the individual receives that specific reinforcer, or also called the listener behavior. And maybe we should talk about the difference between why it's important to know what a speaker behavior is and what a listener behavior is.
That's a great idea. Let's go into it. So a lot of people call spoken language expressive language, but behavior analysts prefer to call this speaker behavior, and this is how Skinner defined it. This is when somebody is specifically vocalizing. It's the things that they say. Listener behavior is often called receptive language, or when somebody is responding to something that's said to them. Behavior analysts like to use speaker and listener instead of expressive and receptive because when you say that language is expressive and receptive and define it as language combined, that infers that it's the same teaching strategy or the same learning process or behavioral process that's happening in both of those instances. But there's tons of research that shows that these two skill sets, speaker behavior and listener behavior, develop completely separately. Therefore, in this presentation and any other presentation you see from Brittany and I, we will refer to anything that somebody says as speaker behavior, and if they're responding to something that someone else is saying to them, we're going to call that listener behavior instead of expressive and receptive language. Cool, so Brittany, can you tell us a little bit more about the antecedent to Mands?
Sure, so the antecedent to a Mand would be a motivating operation. This is just an environmental variable that affects an organism's behavior by either altering the reinforcing or punishing effectiveness of other environmental events, or the frequency of occurrence of behaviors that have been reinforced or punished by those consequences. And is also an establishing operation. So this has two effects. One is that it increases the value of something as a reinforcer. So for example, when it's hot outside, that means water is going to be more valuable at that time.
This establishes water as a reinforcer.
And the secondary effect is that it can increase the likelihood of all behaviors that have been associated with that reinforcer in the past. So in the past, if it's been really hot on a particular day and you've drank water to make yourself obviously hydrate, then you're more likely to do that in the future.
So, if you have a history of asking for water when you're thirsty, this establishing operation increases the likelihood that you'll ask for water when you're hot.
Megan, what happens if there's an individual who doesn't use their vocal verbal behavior?
That's a great question. In these sorts of situations, we would use some sort of augmentative communication device, like maybe PECS, an app like Proloquo, or even sign language.
Oh, okay.
Now let's talk about capturing and contriving establishing operations. We always need to make sure that there's an establishing operation in place before we teach a man. And this is probably one of the biggest, most difficult areas that we see with a lot of registered behavior technicians or even some experienced behavior analysts. It's difficult to make someone want something. Luckily, there are a lot of great procedures for capturing and contriving motivation.
Hey Megan, why is it that we should contrive EOs instead of relying on naturally occurring events?
That's a great question. So if children with autism or other developmental disabilities learned from naturally occurring establishing operations, then we wouldn't have a job. We wouldn't be in there teaching them these communication skills. We need to contrive establishing operations to provide more learning opportunities in shorter amounts of time. So, of course, we can rely on naturally occurring establishing operations. Brittany, can you talk a little bit about capturing establishing operations?
Sure. So in these kinds of situations, you definitely want to take advantage of either there being an event of deprivation or an aversion. So for example, we might want a period of time without food because then food is going to be established as a reinforcer.
Definitely. Great example. Kids love food. I love food.
Another example is that we might play outside on a really hot day. And again, that's going to make water a reinforcer.
And this is another great example of why Jack Michael expanded the definition of motivating operations from not just being deprivation and satiation. Because you can drink water all day long, but if it's really hot, you're still going to want that water even though you're not deprived from it. How about, let's talk about naturally occurring social establishing operation.
Yeah, I think a good example is probably when we have a sibling take away a toy from another sibling, and then that establishes the toy as a reinforcer.
Right? I see it with our dogs too. So, take some time to think for yourself about how you might naturally capture an establishing operation in real life situations. Cool, so we can't give a thorough training on Mands without discussing different types of establishing operations. So there are tons of unconditioned establishing operations, hunger, thirst, sexual desires, but we can't always capitalize on those with the kids, especially my last example. So it's important to have a nice, thorough knowledge on conditioned establishing operations, or CEOs. Brittany, can you tell us a little more about conditioned establishing operations?
Sure, there's two kinds. There's transitive conditioning establishing operation, which is a CEOT, and there's a reflexive condition establishing operation, which is CEOR.
Yeah, those are definitely the most common when we're teaching Mands.
So a transitive condition establishing operation is just when there's a presence of one stimulus that establishes another stimulus as the reinforcer. So for example, if you give a child a coloring book, well, the reinforcer is going to be the crayons or markers that they'll use to draw.
Pro tip, make sure that you give the coloring book before the crayons because kids don't really care what they color on.
Or another example is if you're getting ready to eat a bowl of cereal, well, what's going to be establishing to eat your cereal with? A spoon.
Can you guys think of examples of situations where the presence of one item establishes another item as a reinforcer? If so, then you can use CEOTs in your Mand training. This is a great way to teach Mand for missing items, just like the article by Sundberg and Hall.
A reflexive conditioning establishing operation is just the presence of something establishes that removal of itself as a reinforcer. So for example, if you were to come into contact with a tiger, the removal of that tiger would establish itself as a reinforcer.
Right, probably make you run.
Yeah.
Or when you see that guy who's always trying to slip you those smooth pickup lines at work and you just don't want to deal with it today, He's a CEOR. His removal is a reinforcer. So take some time to think about situations where you or your client have something that you just don't want to be there. The removal of it is a reinforcer. This will help you think about how to teach mands for removal of aversive stimuli. Now let's talk about generalizing mands, because this is really unique compared to how you would generalize all the other verbal operands or other skills like imitation or instruction following. It's just different. So the first type of generalization for mands is generalizing across motivating operations. You also want to consider stimulus generalization and response generalization, and we'll talk about what those are.
So generalization across MOs would mean that you would ask for something in other situations that establishes that stimulus as a reinforcer, right, Megan?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great description. Let's look at some examples of this. So you may see Jimi Hendrix saying, "Can I have a guitar?" So this one mand can occur in many different circumstances. He may want guitars for different reasons. As you know, if you've seen any historical videos of Jimi Hendrix, he may ask for a guitar when there's motivation for him to play some rocking music, but he may also ask for a guitar when he's motivated to light something on fire. He did it, and you would see the same man for that same item in both circumstances, but there's obviously very different antecedent motivating operations present for each of those mands.
Oh, I understand now. So this could be the same as if I was asking for a beer when we could be drinking at a bar, or I could be asking for one just to get one for a friend.
Exactly. Two very different motivations, one to quench your own thirst, the other to maybe condition yourself as a reinforcer with your buddies. But it's the same mand again. Great example, Brittany. The next type of generalization is also used when we're teaching other sorts of skills. It's not specific to mands. This is asking for the same item, using the same sort of phrasing, but in the presence of novel people or places. This is what you typically think of when you're working on generalization of skills with clients. An example that is specific to my pasty self is asking for sunscreen. So stimulus generalization, I may have been taught to ask for sunscreen when I am with other people at a music festival. I may be asking it for them because we're spending long days out in the heat. But we would see stimulus generalization if I start asking another person for that same item in a different context. This is generalizing to novel people and places. Brittany, can you tell us a little bit about response generalization?
Sure. So response generalization is just novel response forms or using different words to ask for the same item. So you might ask one individual to hand you a pair of thongs, but another individual might be more used to saying, "Can I have a flip-flop?" I think this is more so a thing back in the Midwest. Megan, you might have a little bit more information on this, but sometimes out in California, we might say, "Can I have a soda?" But out in the Midwest, it might be, "Can I have a pop?"
Exactly. And another example of this may be using different sentence frames. So this is something that we see a lot, especially with individuals with autism, because they tend to demonstrate that restricted stimulus control and restricted variability in a lot of their behavior. So you may want to teach them different sentence frames. So saying, "Can I have some pop?" versus "Give me that pop." So you're getting the same message across, but using those different sentence frames too. But soda, pop, different sentence frames. It's important to focus on all of these with the individuals that we work with. So take some time and generate your own novel examples of response generalization. This will help you when you're applying it out in your own work. Next, Brittany, how about we touch on just some types of mands really quick before we end our video for today?
So we've already discussed removal of aversive, but there's also mand for an item, mand for an action, mand for a missing item, mand for attention, and mand for information.
My favorite. And within mand for items, teaching mands for adjectives and mands using prepositions, and how to do actions in different ways by manding with adverbs. We'll discuss how to teach all of these different types of mands on our Thinkific page. So make sure you like, subscribe, and follow the link in the comments if you're interested in getting some Type 2 CEUs and learning about how to implement man training in the most efficient and effective way possible. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Megan.
And I'm Brittany.
And we are Teach Me ABA.